When we think about the Victorian age, certain images come to mind. Gas-lit streets glowing faintly in the fog, horse-drawn carriages rattling over cobblestones, the stiff collars and starched dresses of men and women hurrying to their destinations. But there was another world hidden beneath this surface respectability, a world of glittering lights, crowded rooms, and strong drink poured generously into glass tumblers. These were the gin palaces, establishments that captured both fascination and fear in 19th century Britain. The very phrase, gin palace, was designed to impress. Unlike the plain alehouses and taverns that had served the working population for centuries, gin palaces were flamboyant. They were bright, loud, and intentionally dazzling. Step inside and you would be surrounded by mirrored walls, sparkling chandeliers, polished brass fittings, and glass counters that gleamed under the light of newly installed gas lamps. For many Victorians, especially the working poor, these palaces of drink were the closest they would ever come to such luxury. To understand the appeal of the gin palace, we must remember what ordinary life was like for most of the population. For the working classes of Victorian Britain, daily life was often grim. Overcrowded lodgings, long hours of labor, polluted air, and the constant struggle to afford food and coal shaped existence. To step into a gin palace was to step into another world, a world where light conquered darkness, where warmth replaced chill, and where a penny or two could purchase a measure of relief. But relief came with controversy. Gin had long carried a dangerous reputation. In the previous century, Britain had experienced what became known as the gin craze, a period when cheap spirits flooded the market and were blamed for widespread social disorder. Hogarth's famous engraving, Gin Lane, with its scenes of poverty, crime, and neglect, haunted the national imagination. Although the gin craze had ended decades earlier, its shadow lingered. To many reformers, the gin palace was simply a modern continuation of that older threat, a place where vice was sold in glittering disguise. The architecture itself spoke volumes. While taverns and alehouses were often dark, smoky, and old-fashioned, gin palaces were deliberately modern. They embraced the new technologies of the 19th century. Gaslight flooded their interiors, creating a brilliance unknown in most homes. Mirrors multiplied the light, giving the illusion of endless space. Cut glass and brass fittings sparkled, creating an environment that seemed almost theatrical. The gin palace was designed to overwhelm the senses, to draw customers in with spectacle, and to keep them there as long as coins jingled in their pockets. This sensory appeal made the gin palace an object of fascination, but also of suspicion. Critics warned that these glittering establishments were traps, drawing in the poor and seducing them into ruin. Pamphlets railed against the danger of demon drink, insisting that gin palaces destroyed families, wasted wages, and fueled crime. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the moral corruption that spread from these bright halls into the streets beyond. To them, the gin palace was not simply a building, it was a symbol of temptation, vice, and decay. Yet for all the condemnation, gin palaces thrived. By the 1830s and 40s, they had become common in cities and industrial towns. Their presence testified to both the demand for cheap spirits and the ingenuity of those who sold them. They catered not only to the desperate poor, but also to curious members of the middle classes, who sometimes entered these establishments out of fascination or even rebellion against respectability. The word palace was no exaggeration. For many, these halls of gin were the most splendid public spaces they would ever see. We should also consider the social role of these establishments. For many workers, gin palaces were gathering places. After long shifts, men and women crowded inside, exchanging stories, complaints, and laughter. The bright lights and polished surfaces created a sense of community, however fleeting. Alcohol dulled pain, softened hardship, and provided a moment of escape. Critics saw only ruin, but patrons found fellowship and, at least for a short while, comfort. At the same time, the gin palace revealed the contradictions of Victorian society. On one hand, it embodied modernity, gaslight, glass, and spectacle. On the other, it carried ancient fears, the fear of drink, of disorder, of moral collapse. It was both progress and decline, both luxury and degradation. To step into a gin palace was to step into a contested space, one celebrated by some, condemned by others, and used by many simply because it offered cheap relief. In this series, we will explore these establishments in detail. We will trace their origins, examine their architecture, listen to the voices of reformers and drinkers, and see how they shaped Victorian nights. We will look at how class, gender, health, religion, and law all intersected in the world of gin palaces. And we will ask what these glittering halls reveal about the society that built them. This is mild history. Calm, steady, perhaps even a little boring. But in the quiet details of gaslight and glass, of cheap gin poured into tumblers, of laughter and argument echoing in mirrored halls, we glimpse the heart of Victorian life. The gin palace was more than a place to drink. It was a stage upon which the anxieties, pleasures, and contradictions of the age were performed. And so, with that image before us, the glass sparkling, the gas lamps flickering, the hum of voices rising, let us begin. To understand why the Victorians built such glittering establishments, we first need to ask a simple question. What exactly was a gin palace? The term itself suggests grandeur, but behind the shine of gaslight and the glimmer of mirrors lay something very practical: the sale of cheap spirits to large numbers of customers. A gin palace was, in essence, a public house, but one that elevated the business of selling gin into a spectacle. The gin palace emerged in the early 19th century, around the 1830s, at a moment when Britain was changing rapidly. Cities were swelling with new arrivals from the countryside. Industrial work kept people in towns late into the night. Wages were often low and working conditions harsh. Ordinary taverns and alehouses had long been places of refreshment, but the gin palace offered something different: brightness, glamour, and accessibility. It was in many ways a response to the grimness of urban life. What distinguished the gin palace from an ordinary public house was first and foremost its appearance. Alehouses were often small, dark, and old-fashioned, with wooden beams and smoky fires. By contrast, gin palaces were modern creations, designed to attract attention from the street. They had wide glass windows that revealed brilliant interiors. At night, the glow of gaslight spilled into the street, drawing in passers-by like moths to a flame. The effect was intentional. These were shops of drink, advertising themselves as boldly as any department store. When we think about the Victorian age, certain images come to mind. Gaslit streets glowing faintly in the fog. Horse-drawn carriages rattling over cobblestones. the stiff collars and starched dresses of men and women hurrying to their destinations. But there was another world hidden beneath this surface respectability, a world of glittering lights, crowded rooms, and strong drink poured generously into glass tumblers. These were the gin palaces, establishments that captured both fascination and fear in 19th century Britain. The very phrase gin palace was designed to impress. Unlike the plain alehouses and taverns that had served the working population for centuries, gin palaces were flamboyant. They were bright, loud, and intentionally dazzling. Step inside and you would be surrounded by mirrored walls, sparkling chandeliers, polished brass fittings, and glass counters that gleamed under the light of newly installed gas lamps. For many Victorians, especially the working poor, these palaces of drink were the closest they would ever come to such luxury. To understand the appeal of the gin palace, we must remember what ordinary life was like for most of the population. For the working classes of Victorian Britain, daily life was often grim. Overcrowded lodgings, long hours of labor, polluted air, and the constant struggle to afford food and coal shaped existence. To step into a gin palace was to step into another world, a world where light conquered darkness, where warmth replaced chill, and where a penny or two could purchase a measure of relief. But relief came with controversy. Gin had long carried a dangerous reputation. In the previous century, Britain had experienced what became known as the gin craze, a period when cheap spirits flooded the market and were blamed for widespread social disorder. Hogarth's famous engraving Gin Lane, with its scenes of poverty, crime, and neglect, haunted the national imagination. Although the gin craze had ended decades earlier, its shadow lingered. To many reformers, the gin palace was simply a modern continuation of that older threat, a place where vice was sold in glittering disguise. The architecture itself spoke volumes. While taverns and alehouses were often dark, smoky, and old-fashioned, gin palaces were deliberately modern. They embraced the new technologies of the 19th century. Gaslight flooded their interiors, creating a brilliance unknown in most homes. Mirrors multiplied the light, giving the illusion of endless space. Cut glass and brass fittings sparkled, creating an environment that seemed almost theatrical. The gin palace was designed to overwhelm the senses, to draw customers in with spectacle, and to keep them there as long as coins jingled in their pockets. This sensory appeal made the gin palace an object of fascination, but also of suspicion. Critics warned that these glittering establishments were traps, drawing in the poor and seducing them into ruin. Pamphlets railed against the danger of demon drink, insisting that gin palaces destroyed families, wasted wages, and fueled crime. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the moral corruption that spread from these bright halls into the streets beyond. To them, the gin palace was not simply a building, it was a symbol of temptation, vice, and decay. Yet for all the condemnation, gin palaces thrived. By the 1830s and 40s, they had become common in cities and industrial towns. Their presence testified to both the demand for cheap spirits and the ingenuity of those who sold them. They catered not only to the desperate poor, but also to curious members of the middle classes, who sometimes entered these establishments out of fascination or even rebellion against respectability. The word palace was no exaggeration. For many, these halls of gin were the most splendid public spaces they would ever see. We should also consider the social role of these establishments. For many workers, gin palaces were gathering places. After long shifts, men and women crowded inside, exchanging stories, complaints, and laughter. The bright lights and polished surfaces created a sense of community, however fleeting. Alcohol dulled pain, softened hardship, and provided a moment of escape. Critics saw only ruin, but patrons found fellowship and, at least for a short while, comfort. At the same time, the Gin Palace revealed the contradictions of Victorian society. On one hand, it embodied modernity, gaslight, glass, and spectacle. On the other, it carried ancient fears, the fear of drink, of disorder, of moral collapse. It was both progress and decline, both luxury and degradation. To step into a gin palace was to step into a contested space, one celebrated by some, condemned by others, and used by many simply because it offered cheap relief. In this series, we will explore these establishments in detail. We will trace their origins, examine their architecture, listen to the voices of reformers and drinkers, and see how they shaped Victorian nights. We will look at how class, gender, health, religion, and law all intersected in the world of gin palaces. And we will ask what these glittering halls reveal about the society that built them. This is mild history. Calm, steady, perhaps even a little boring. But in the quiet details of gaslight and glass, of cheap gin poured into tumblers, of laughter and argument echoing in mirrored halls, we glimpse the heart of Victorian life. The Gin Palace was more than a place to drink. It was a stage upon which the anxieties, pleasures, and contradictions of the age were performed. And so, with that image before us, the glass sparkling, the gas lamps flickering, the hum of voices rising, let us begin. To understand why the Victorians built such glittering establishments, we first need to ask a simple question. What exactly was a gin palace? The term itself suggests grandeur, but behind the shine of gaslight and the glimmer of mirrors lay something very practical: the sale of cheap spirits to large numbers of customers. A gin palace was, in essence, a public house, but one that elevated the business of selling gin into a spectacle. The gin palace emerged in the early 19th century, around the 1830s, at a moment when Britain was changing rapidly. Cities were swelling with new arrivals from the countryside. Industrial work kept people in towns late into the night. Wages were often low and working conditions harsh. Ordinary taverns and alehouses had long been places of refreshment, but the Gin Palace offered something different: brightness, glamour, and accessibility. It was in many ways a response to the grimness of urban life. What distinguished the Gin Palace from an ordinary public house was first and foremost its appearance. Alehouses were often small, dark, and old-fashioned, with wooden beams and smoky fires. By contrast, gin palaces were modern creations, designed to attract attention from the street. They had wide glass windows that revealed brilliant interiors. At night, the glow of gaslight spilled into the street, drawing in passers-by like moths to a flame. The effect was intentional. These were shops of drink, advertising themselves as boldly as any department store. If there was one thing that set the Gin Palace apart from the older tavern or alehouse, it was its appearance. These establishments were not designed to hide in the shadows of narrow streets. They were designed to dazzle, to overwhelm, and to impress. Architecture and atmosphere were not afterthoughts. They were the very essence of the Gin Palace.
carefully constructed to lure passers-by and hold their attention. On the outside, the first thing one noticed was light. Gaslight, still a novelty in the early 19th century, poured through large plate glass windows, bathing the street in brightness. Where most buildings were dark and uninviting at night, the Jinn Palace glowed like a beacon. The effect was striking. For those walking home from work through dim alleys and fog, the glow of a Jinn Palace promised warmth, cheer, and activity. Its brilliance seemed to defy the surrounding gloom of industrial cities. The windows themselves were part of the spectacle. They were large, sometimes stretching the height of the ground floor, framed by ornate moldings or columns. Behind them, customers could see glittering chandeliers, mirrors, and crowds of drinkers. The message was clear. Here was life, light, and abundance. The transparency of glass allowed the spectacle to spill into the street, advertising the establishment without the need for signs or posters. Once inside, the effect intensified. Mirrors lined the walls, multiplying the gaslight and giving the impression of endless space. Brass fittings gleamed under the glow. Cut glass decanters sparkled like jewels. Chandeliers, often elaborate in design, hung from ceilings, casting light across every surface. The eye could hardly rest. Wherever one looked, light was refracted, and intensified. The result was a space that seemed far larger, far richer, and far more modern than it truly was. The architecture was not merely decorative, it was functional. Counters were long and wide, designed to serve large numbers of customers quickly. Behind them stood rows of glass vessels filled with gin and other spirits, their contents displayed proudly. The arrangement was theatrical, turning the act of buying a drink into a performance. Customers did not simply hand over coins. They became part of a spectacle of commerce, surrounded by glass, light, and reflection. Floors were often tiled, their patterns catching and reflecting light. Walls were painted in bright colors or papered with bold designs. Even small details, like gilded frames or polished wood, contributed to the overall impression of luxury. Yet this luxury was not expensive to experience. For a penny or two, a laborer could step into surroundings that imitated the wealth of palaces, theaters, or great houses. The architecture democratized spectacle, offering it to those who would never otherwise see such grandeur. The atmosphere of a Jinn palace was equally important. These were not quiet spaces for leisurely conversation. They were bustling, noisy, and crowded. The hum of voices, the clink of glasses, the laughter and quarrels of patrons created a constant din. Gaslight, though brilliant, added a warmth that made rooms feel enclosed, almost feverish. The combination of brightness, noise, and crowd created a sensory experience that was overwhelming and intoxicating even before a drop of gin was consumed. For reformers, this atmosphere was deeply troubling. They argued that the dazzling architecture masked the dangers within. The light and mirrors distracted patrons from the harsh reality that their wages were being drained, their health endangered, and their morals corrupted. Critics compared the palaces to traps, luring the poor with false glamour. Pamphlets described them as glittering halls of ruin, their very brilliance a sign of vice. Yet for patrons, the atmosphere was part of the appeal. After hours in factories or cramped homes, the noise of the gin palace felt alive, the light felt warm, and the crowd felt like community. The architecture gave them for a short while the illusion of belonging to a grander world. The mirrors did more than reflect light. They reflected the patrons themselves, placing them in a space of brightness they rarely occupied. It is telling that many contemporary observers compared gin palaces to theaters. Both were spaces of spectacle, both designed to dazzle audiences, both reliant on light, glass, and illusion. To enter a gin palace was to step into a performance of wealth, even if that wealth was only a veneer. For the cost of a dram, one could feel for a moment like an actor on the stage of modernity. Architecture also served another purpose: efficiency. The design allowed bartenders to serve quickly, maximizing profit. Long counters, clear displays, and open spaces ensured constant movement. Unlike the cozy corners of alehouses, gin palaces discouraged lingering over a single drink. They encouraged quick transactions, repeated often, feeding the energy of the room. The brilliance of the design was that it combined spectacle with commerce seamlessly.
Over time, the architecture of gin palaces influenced other public spaces. Elements of their design, gaslight, glass, mirrors, spread into shops, arcades, and even private homes. The palaces were not only places to drink, but also models of modern urban architecture. They shaped how Victorians imagined brightness, space, and display. Still, the atmosphere was not for everyone. Some visitors described it as overwhelming, even oppressive. The glare of gaslight hurt the eyes, the press of bodies made breathing difficult, and the constant noise could exhaust rather than enliven. For those unaccustomed to such spaces, the brilliance quickly became a burden. The same features that dazzled many repelled others. In the end, architecture and atmosphere defined the gin palace as much as the gin itself. The buildings were temples of light in an age of darkness, spectacles of modernity in a world of poverty. They drew people in not only with drink, but with design, not only with spirits, but with spectacle. To ask why people entered is to miss the point. The architecture itself was an answer. To truly grasp the role of the gin palace in Victorian life, we must begin with the people who formed the majority of its customers, the working poor. For them, gin was not merely a drink, it was a comfort, a medicine, a fleeting escape, and sometimes a curse. The palaces that glittered with gaslight were built with this class in mind, for it was they who filled the counters night after night. The 19th century was an era of hardship for Britain's working classes. Industrialization brought jobs, but also long hours, dangerous conditions, and little security. Men, women, and even children worked 12 or 14-hour days in factories, mines, and workshops. Wages were low, often just enough to cover rent, bread, and coal. Families crowded into 1- or 2-room lodgings where damp walls and poor ventilation made life miserable. Illness was common. Comfort was rare. In such conditions, gin offered relief. It was cheap, strong, and widely available. For a penny, a man could purchase a measure that dulled pain and quieted hunger. For a mother, gin could serve as a quick remedy for toothache, colic, or fatigue. For children, though rarely admitted openly, spirits were sometimes given in small doses to help them sleep or to keep them calm while parents worked. The gin palace catered to these needs, selling not just alcohol, but moments of escape from relentless struggle. Critics often accused the working poor of weakness, of wasting wages on drink instead of bread.
Reformers published pamphlets showing scenes of drunkenness, neglect, and poverty. But such portrayals ignored the context. For many laborers, gin was not indulgence, it was survival. It warmed bodies in unheated rooms. It numbed the aches of muscles strained by endless work. It provided a few hours of laughter in lives otherwise marked by monotony and exhaustion. To dismiss this as vice was to overlook the desperation that made it necessary. The atmosphere of the gin palace amplified the attraction. For people whose homes were small, dark, and overcrowded, the brightness of a gin palace was intoxicating even before the first drink was poured. To step inside was to enter a world of space, light, and energy. Mirrors multiplied the crowd, making patrons feel part of something larger. Brass fittings and chandeliers hinted at luxury. In that moment, the poor could imagine themselves elevated, sharing in splendor that elsewhere was denied to them. We must also remember that gin was fast. The standing counters and small measures encouraged quick drinking. A worker could stop in, swallow a dram, and leave within minutes. This suited the rhythms of industrial life, where breaks were short and evenings were crowded with chores. Gin required no time, no preparation, and no ceremony. It delivered its effects quickly and efficiently, which made it particularly appealing to those with little leisure. Yet this speed also carried dangers. Quick drinking meant more drinking. Strong spirits, consumed rapidly, took hold before judgment could intervene. Men stumbled home drunk, wages gone. Women were accused of neglecting children, lulled into stupor by gin. Reformers seized on these stories, warning of moral collapse. The drunken mother became a stock image in Victorian propaganda, used to rally support for temperance. But while some families were indeed ruined, many more used gin in moderation, balancing relief against necessity. Another element was community. The gin palace was not only a place to drink, but a place to gather. Men and women met friends there, shared gossip, and found companionship. For people whose lodgings were too cramped for visitors, the palace offered public sociality. It was noisy, yes, and sometimes quarrelsome, but it was also alive with laughter and camaraderie. For the lonely, the palace was one of the few places where they could feel part of a crowd, where they could belong. Children, too, felt the effects of the gin palace, though indirectly. Reformers described wages meant for bread being squandered at the counter, leaving children hungry. Accounts of neglected infants fueled public anger. Yet others noted that some parents, far from being careless, brought home gin as a form of medicine. In the absence of affordable doctors or proper remedies, spirits served as treatment for pain, coughs, or sleeplessness. The line between indulgence and necessity blurred. Gin, like poverty itself, was complicated. It is worth noting that the working poor were not passive victims of drink. They made choices, however constrained. Many balanced their budgets carefully, spending a portion of wages on gin while ensuring enough remained for rent and food. Others avoided spirits altogether, preferring beer, which was weaker and more filling. Still others joined temperance societies, rejecting drink entirely. The poor were diverse in their habits, and while gin palaces were crowded, they did not capture everyone.
Nevertheless, gin became closely associated with the working classes in the Victorian imagination. Respectable society often looked down on them, equating poverty with drunkenness. The gin palace, with its noisy crowds and cheap drinks, symbolized the supposed weakness of the laboring poor. Yet this was a caricature. What the palaces truly revealed was not moral failing, but economic hardship. They were monuments to inequality, places where the poor sought comfort in a society that gave them little. In the end, the relationship between the working poor and gin was one of necessity
and tension. Gin was a solace, a medicine, and a momentary escape. It was also a danger, capable of draining wages and damaging families. The gin palace provided light and laughter, but also carried risks of addiction and ruin. To condemn the poor for drinking was to ignore the world that drove them to it. The gin palace, then, was not simply a den of vice. It was a refuge, however flawed, for those who had few other comforts. It reflected the desperation of lives lived on the edge, but also the resilience of people who sought moments of relief wherever they could find them. When we turn from the working poor to the Victorian middle classes, the story of the gin palace shifts. For clerks, shopkeepers, school teachers, and professionals, gin was not usually a daily staple or a desperate comfort. It was instead a curiosity, a temptation, and at times a scandal. The middle classes did not frequent gin palaces in the same numbers as the laboring poor, but they were fascinated by them. And their relationship to these glittering halls reveals as much about respectability as it does about drink. The Victorian middle classes defined themselves by discipline. Respectability was their badge of honor, distinguishing them from the aristocracy above and the working poor below. They prided themselves on moderation, industriousness, and self-control. A middle-class household might enjoy tea in the drawing room, a glass of sherry with guests, or wine at a dinner party. But spirits consumed in public carried a different meaning. To be seen entering a gin palace could risk gossip, for these establishments were associated with the poor, with disorder, and with vice. Yet curiosity often drew them in. The brilliance of the architecture, the sheer novelty of gaslit interiors and mirrored walls proved irresistible to many. Clerks walking home at night might slip inside for a dram, intrigued by the spectacle. Shopkeepers, after closing their stores, might visit briefly, less for the drink than for the experience of standing in a hall that glittered like a theater. Young men, eager to test boundaries, sometimes entered in groups, laughing as they sampled the cheap spirits. For them, the palace was entertainment, a diversion from the routines of respectability. But indulgence came with risks. A middle-class man caught drunk in a gin palace could face humiliation. His employer might question his discipline. His neighbors might whisper, and his family could be shamed. Respectability was fragile, and alcohol threatened to undermine it. For women of the middle classes, the risk was even greater. A lady seen in such a place might face outright scandal, for female drinking was heavily stigmatized. This fear kept many away, but it also added to the allure. What was forbidden often attracted interest. Newspapers and journals fed this fascination. Articles described the interiors of gin palaces in lavish detail, emphasizing their light, their glass, and their crowds. Some writers approached the subject with moral concern, warning readers of the dangers within. Others treated the palaces almost as tourist attractions, places worth visiting to see modern life in its rawest form. Middle-class readers, sitting in parlors with lamps and books, consumed these accounts eagerly. The gin palace became part of their cultural imagination, whether or not they ever set foot inside. There was also a measure of hypocrisy. Some middle-class Victorians condemned gin palaces publicly while indulging privately. A clerk might join a temperance society by day and sip a dram at night. A shopkeeper might denounce drunkenness while selling goods to customers whose wages were spent on drink. Respectability demanded a public show of discipline, but behind closed doors, indulgence sometimes continued. The gin palace embodied this tension. It was both a temptation and a threat, both condemned and secretly enjoyed. Medical and moral literature of the time also reflected middle-class anxieties. Pamphlets aimed at clerks and teachers warned that even occasional drinking could lead to ruin. Stories circulated of young men who entered gin palaces out of curiosity and ended in poverty, crime, or death. These cautionary tales reinforced the idea that one visit could begin a slippery slope disguised as entertainment.
Yet not all views were negative. Some middle-class observers admired the architecture, even as they condemned the drink. They noted how the use of gaslight, glass, and mirrors represented progress in design. Others acknowledged the palaces as symbols of modern urban life, places that revealed the vibrancy of cities. While they did not wish to see their neighbors frequenting them, they could not deny the appeal. It is also worth remembering that the middle classes were not uniform. For some, especially the upwardly mobile, avoiding the gin palace was a matter of distinction, a way to separate themselves from the working poor. For others, particularly those with looser ties to respectability, occasional visits were tolerated. The boundaries were flexible, negotiated in private. What united them was the constant awareness of being watched, of needing to maintain appearances in a society where reputation was everything. In this way, the gin palace served as a kind of stage for the middle classes, even when they did not enter. Its presence in cities forced them to consider their own values. Were they truly above such indulgence? Could they resist curiosity? Did respectability mean abstinence, or was moderation acceptable? The palace, glittering on the street corner, raised these questions daily. For reformers, the middle classes were both allies and targets. Campaigns against gin relied on middle-class support, using their sense of morality to push for legislation. At the same time, reformers warned them not to be seduced by the palace's charms. The very existence of these establishments was presented as a threat not just to the poor, but to society as a whole. If the middle classes faltered, reformers argued, then all of Britain risked decline. In the end, the relationship between the middle classes and the gin palace was one of ambivalence. Few relied on gin as daily sustenance, but many were intrigued by its world. Respectability kept them at a distance, but curiosity pulled them near. Some entered and regretted it, others indulged quietly, and many more simply observed from afar, imagining the glittering interiors described in newspapers. The gin palace was for them a mirror of temptation, reflecting both their fears and their desires. Thus, while the working poor filled the counters, the middle classes lingered at the edges, their presence quieter but no less significant. The gin palace forced them to confront their own contradictions, their fascination with modernity, their fear of vice, and their constant struggle to maintain respectability in a changing world. When we think about the gin palace in Victorian Britain, it is tempting to picture only men, tired laborers drinking after long shifts, or groups of young clerks slipping inside to test the boundaries of respectability. Yet women, too, had a complex and important relationship with gin. Their presence in these establishments carried deep social meaning,
revealing the anxieties and double standards of Victorian society. From the beginning, female drinking attracted more scrutiny than male drinking. A man who drank too much might be criticized for weakness, but he could still be excused as one of the lads or as someone blowing off steam after work. A woman who drank, however, faced harsher judgment. Respectability for women was tied not only to discipline, but also to purity, motherhood, and domestic responsibility. To be seen with a glass of gin was to risk not only one's reputation, but also one's identity as a proper woman. The working poor, however, could not afford to uphold these strict standards. Women in factories, laundries, and domestic service worked long hours just like men. Their bodies ached, their spirits flagged, and gin offered the same relief it did to their husbands, brothers, and fathers. For some, it was also practical. Mothers used small doses of spirits as remedies for pain or to quiet restless children. In households without access to doctors or medicines, gin became a form of self-care, however crude. This practical use of gin often blurred into stigma. Reformers and journalists seized upon the figure of the drunken mother as a symbol of social decline. Pamphlets depicted women abandoning their children for the counter of the gin palace or spending wages meant for bread on spirits. These images circulated widely, fueling moral panic. Yet the reality was far more nuanced. Many women balanced their responsibilities carefully, seeking moments of relief without neglecting their families. The stereotype of the drunken mother was often exaggerated, but it stuck because it captured Victorian anxieties about gender and morality. Middle-class women, meanwhile, faced an even stricter code. A respectable lady was not expected to enter a gin palace under any circumstances. To do so was to invite scandal. Instead, their drinking, if it occurred, took place privately, within the safety of the home, and usually with wine or fortified drinks such as sherry. Spirits in public belonged to a different world, one that threatened their status. Yet gossip columns sometimes whispered of middle-class women glimpsed in gin palaces, treating such stories as evidence of hidden vice lurking beneath the veneer of respectability.
There was also the question of fallen women, prostitutes, and others living on the margins of society. For them, the gin palace was both a workplace and a refuge. Brightly lit and crowded, these establishments offered opportunities to meet clients, to escape the dangers of the street, and to find companionship with others in similar circumstances. Gin dulled fear and provided confidence, though at the cost of health and wages. Reformers pointed to the presence of such women as proof of the gin palace's moral corruption, but for the women themselves, it was often a matter of survival. The double standard was stark. Men who drank could redeem themselves through work, discipline, or even humor. Women who drank, especially in public, were labeled immoral, fallen, or unfit for motherhood. Respectability demanded sobriety from them in a way it did not from men. This imbalance reveals much about Victorian values. Women were expected to uphold the moral fabric of the household, and any deviation was treated not just as personal failure, but as social danger. Yet despite these pressures, women continued to drink. Diaries, letters, and court records show evidence of their presence in gin palaces. Some went with husbands or family members, others with friends, and some alone. Their experiences varied. Some enjoyed laughter and camaraderie. Others faced harassment or judgment. The palace was not designed with women in mind, but women nevertheless carved out spaces within it. It is also worth noting that the temperance movement,
which gained strength throughout the 19th century, was often led by women. Many who opposed gin did so not only out of moral conviction, but also from lived experience of the harm it caused in families. Wives who saw husbands spend wages on drink, or who endured violence fueled by alcohol, became some of the most passionate reformers. For them, opposing the gin palace was a way of protecting their homes and asserting their voices in a society that often silenced them. The tension between female drinking and female reform created a powerful narrative. On one side stood the figure of the drunken mother, or fallen woman, used by critics to illustrate the dangers of gin. On the other stood the sober reformer, campaigning for temperance and discipline. Both were simplified images, yet both shaped public debates. Women, whether drinking or abstaining, played central roles in the story of the gin palace. Ultimately, the relationship between women and gin palaces reflects the broader contradictions of Victorian society. Women were expected to be pure, yet endured harsh conditions that drove them to the same comforts as men. They were condemned for drinking, yet praised when they fought against drink. Their presence in gin palaces scandalized some, fascinated others, and revealed the deep unease Victorians felt about gender, morality, and modern life. The gin palace was not simply a male domain. It was a contested space where women navigated stigma, necessity, and survival. It exposed the double standards of respectability and highlighted the ways in which class and gender intersected. For some women, it was a place of laughter and relief. For others, it was a symbol of ruin. For reformers, it was a battlefield in the fight for morality. In every case, women mattered. Their relationship to gin, whether through use, condemnation, or reform, shaped how Victorian society understood the palace itself. Without them, the story of these glittering halls is incomplete. To fully understand the place of gin palaces in Victorian life, we have to step back and look at the shadow that loomed over them, the memory of the 18th century gin craze. Though it ended decades before the Victorian era began, this period of unrestrained drinking left such a deep imprint on Britain's collective memory that it haunted public debates, government policy, and even the design of gin palaces themselves. In some ways, the Victorians never stopped reacting to that earlier age of excess. The gin craze began in the early 1700s, when Parliament encouraged the distillation of spirits as a way to use surplus grain and reduce reliance on imported brandy. Cheap gin flooded the market, and for the urban poor, it became a central feature of daily life. Prices were so low that gin was sometimes cheaper than beer or even bread. The results were predictable: addiction, neglect, and visible social disorder. William Hogarth's famous engraving, Gin Lane, published in 1751, depicts the nightmare vividly. In the image, a drunken mother drops her baby from her arms, while chaos, ruin, and death fill the background. This single image came to symbolize the dangers of gin for generations.
By the time Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837, the gin craze had already been curbed through stricter laws and higher taxes. Yet its legacy remained powerful. Reformers, politicians, and moralists constantly invoked it as a warning of what could happen if gin consumption was left unchecked. Every glittering gin palace, with its polished mirrors and gas lights, carried with it a faint echo of gin lane. People worried. Were these establishments simply the gin craze dressed up in finer clothes? The Victorians were obsessed with contrasts: progress versus decay, respectability versus vice, light versus darkness. In their minds, the gin craze represented the worst of what unchecked indulgence could produce. Its excesses were linked not only to poverty and crime, but also to national decline. Critics argued that widespread drunkenness had weakened Britain morally and physically, leaving it vulnerable to enemies abroad. Thus, when gin palaces began spreading across cities in the mid-19th century, many commentators treated them not as harmless amusements, but as harbingers of another possible crisis. Yet, interestingly, the gin palace was not simply a repeat of the old gin shops. It was a deliberate attempt to transform the culture of drinking into something more respectable. Earlier gin shops had been dingy, cramped, and unregulated. By contrast, the Victorian gin palace was brightly lit, carefully decorated, and often designed to resemble a theater or grand hotel. Supporters claimed that by making drinking more public and visible, the palaces reduced the worst forms of disorder. Patrons stood at long counters instead of hiding in shadowy corners. Women, though still controversial guests, could enter without as much risk to their safety. In short, gin was being civilized. But memory is stubborn. The ghost of the 18th century excesses haunted every debate. Politicians, especially those aligned with the temperance movement, often warned that beneath the polished mirrors of the gin palace lay the same dangers of ruin, poverty, and crime. Newspapers reprinted Hogarth's engravings, drawing direct comparisons between the past and the present. The lesson was clear. If society became complacent, the horrors of the gin craze could return. This historical memory also shaped legislation. The 19th century saw repeated efforts to regulate drinking hours, licensing, and taxation. Though these laws addressed many types of alcohol, gin was always at the center of the conversation. Its reputation was too infamous to ignore. Even as beer houses multiplied and wine gained popularity among the middle class, gin remained a spirit most closely associated with decline. The Victorians, eager to show themselves as disciplined and modern, could never quite shake the fear that they were living in the shadow of their forebears' mistakes. The shadow also lingered in popular culture. Novels, plays, and pamphlets frequently invoked the image of drunken mothers, neglected children, and collapsing homes, images drawn directly from the gin craze. Charles Dickens, for instance, often depicted the destructive effects of alcohol on families. His characters sometimes drank beer or wine, but when he wanted to signal true desperation, gin was the drink of choice. For his readers, the connection was immediate and obvious. At the same time, the very act of remembering the gin craze allowed Victorians to reassure themselves of their progress. They told themselves that while their ancestors had wallowed in vice, they had built a more disciplined, respectable society. The gin palace, with its gleaming surfaces, seemed to prove that they could enjoy drink without sliding into chaos. This mixture of pride and anxiety gave the Victorian drinking culture its distinctive tension, a desire to indulge paired with a constant fear of decline. We should also remember that the gin craze was not just a story of excess, but also of inequality. The poor bore the brunt of both the addiction and the moral condemnation. Wealthier drinkers often escaped criticism, even when they consumed heavily. In the Victorian period, this pattern continued. Middle-class and upper-class drinking was excused or hidden, while working-class gin palaces drew the harshest judgment. By constantly recalling the gin craze, reformers reinforced the idea that the lower classes needed discipline and control, another way in which memory served the politics of the present. So, the shadow of the gin craze was not only a cautionary tale, but also a tool. It gave reformers a powerful symbol with which to campaign for temperance. It gave legislatures a justification for tighter controls. And it gave middle-class Victorians a way to feel morally superior to both their ancestors and their poorer neighbors. The past was not just remembered, it was actively used to shape the present. The irony, of course, is that despite all the anxiety, gin palaces thrived. People flocked to them in huge numbers, drawn by their lights, their atmosphere, and their promise of escape. The shadow of the gin craze never drove people entirely away from spirits. Instead, it became part of the drama of drinking itself, a reminder that pleasure was always tinged with danger, that beneath the bright gaslights lurked the possibility of ruin. In this way, the Victorians drank not only their gin, but also their history. Every glass carried with it both the joy of the moment and the memory of darker times. And perhaps that was part of the appeal. To drink gin in a palace was to stand at the intersection of progress and peril, respectability and ruin. The shadow of the gin craze made each sip more meaningful, more dramatic, and, in a strange way, more Victorian. If you stepped into a gin palace in Victorian London, the first thing you would notice wasn't the smell of alcohol. It wasn't the rowdy chatter of dock workers or the shrill laughter of market women. It was the light. Gas lamps blazed through massive plate glass windows, flooding the street with a golden glow. In a city where most houses were lit by a single candle, this was dazzling, almost theatrical. The very design of gin palaces shouted, "Come inside, join the spectacle."
The buildings themselves were bold statements of confidence. Unlike the dingy taverns and smoky alehouses they replaced, gin palaces were built to impress. They borrowed ideas from theaters, opera houses, and the great shopping arcades of the era. Tall ceilings, gilded cornices, and intricate plasterwork made patrons feel as though they had stepped into a miniature palace, hence the name. Even the poorest laborer, who might live in a one-room lodging, could spend a few pennies and drink in surroundings that felt extravagant. The use of plate glass was revolutionary. Advances in manufacturing in the early 19th century meant that for the first time, glass could be produced in large, clear sheets. Gin palaces embraced this innovation, lining their facades with enormous windows. Passers-by could see directly into the glittering interior, rows of crystal bottles, polished brass fittings, and mirrored walls. The transparency wasn't accidental. It was a form of advertising. Why paste a poster when the building itself could act as a billboard? The more dazzling the display, the more likely curious pedestrians would step inside. Inside, mirrors multiplied the effect. Large, ornate mirrors hung behind the bar, reflecting both the customers and the rows of gin bottles. This wasn't just decoration. Mirrors made the room seem larger, brighter, and more opulent. They also allowed staff to discreetly keep an eye on patrons, a subtle nod to order in a place that could easily descend into chaos. Then there was the bar counter itself. Traditional taverns often had a simple wooden table where drinks were served. Gin palaces transformed this into a centerpiece. Long counters, often made of polished mahogany or oak, stretched across the room. Brass rails, marble tops, and carved pillars gave the bar the status of an altar. Customers lined up shoulder to shoulder, elbowing for space, and the very design encouraged speed. Quick service meant quick turnover. In a way, the architecture was shaping behavior. Drink fast, order another, move along.
Ceilings in these establishments were equally important. High, vaulted ceilings created a sense of grandeur, but also served a practical purpose. They allowed smoke from lamps and pipes to rise away from the patrons. Decorative plasterwork, scrolls, rosettes, cornices, added to the illusion that one was drinking in a ballroom rather than a public house. Chandeliers or elaborate gas fixtures dangled overhead, their light refracting off glass and metal to create an almost sparkling effect. Flooring mattered too. While poorer alehouses might have bare wood or even packed earth, gin palaces boasted patterned tiles. Mosaic designs, often in geometric or floral motifs, were both decorative and easy to clean. Remember, hundreds of boots tracked in mud, horse manure, and coal dust daily. Tile was not just about elegance, it was about practicality in an age before deep cleaning was simple. Another feature that set gin palaces apart was the sheer use of color. Walls were painted in rich hues, deep reds, greens, and golds. Combined with polished wood and flickering gaslight, the atmosphere was warm, almost seductive. In a fog-bound London night, stepping into such color felt like entering another world. Behind the scenes, architecture was also working hard. Gin palaces needed cellars for storage, ice rooms for keeping drinks cool, and ventilation systems to deal with the heat of so many bodies packed inside. Many establishments installed elaborate dumbwaiters to carry casks and bottles up to the bar. These weren't amateur operations. They were carefully designed spaces built for efficiency, spectacle, and profit. It's important to remember that gin palaces were controversial. Critics claimed they were traps of vice, deliberately engineered to lure the working classes into ruin. The architecture seemed to prove their point. Everything about the design, bright lights, gleaming glass, mirrored walls, was meant to entice, to overwhelm the senses, to make sobriety outside seem drab by comparison. Moral reformers accused architects of turning drinking into theater, and in many ways they were right. But for ordinary Londoners, these buildings offered something rare, a sense of belonging in splendor. For the cost of a small glass of gin, a dock worker could stand beneath chandeliers, lean on marble counters, and be surrounded by gilt and glass. It was a taste of glamour in a life otherwise dominated by toil, grime, and poverty. That contrast was intoxicating in more ways than one. By the mid-19th century, gin palaces had become a defining feature of London's landscape. Artists sketched them, writers described them, and tourists gawked at their glittering facades. Charles Dickens, ever the social observer, described them as perfectly dazzling, filled with gaslight and glitter. For him, the sheer artificial brightness symbolized both the allure and the danger of industrial modernity. Over time, the design of gin palaces influenced the development of the modern pub. The lavish decor might have toned down, but the long bar counter, mirrored walls, and tiled floors survived into the 20th century and beyond. Walk into certain London pubs today, and you can still trace their DNA back to those first gin palaces. In the end, the architecture of these establishments was more than style. It was strategy. It pulled people off dark streets, promised them comfort and glamour, and kept them spending as long as possible. Critics saw manipulation. Customers saw magic. Either way, the design of the gin palace left an indelible mark on not only Victorian nightlife, but on the very idea of what a public drinking space could be.
To understand Victorian gin palaces fully,
You have to picture them not only as buildings, but as stages. Every customer who walked through those enormous plate glass doors became both spectator and performer in a nightly drama of class, gender, and survival. In an era when leisure options were limited, gin palaces offered more than just alcohol. They provided spectacle, company, and a place where the strict boundaries of Victorian society blurred, at least for a few hours. The first striking aspect of this social theater was the mixing of classes. Traditionally, taverns and alehouses had been neighborhood institutions. Locals drank with locals, and one's social standing determined where you could or could not go. Gin palaces disrupted that pattern. Their location on busy high streets, often near markets, theaters, or railway stations, meant they attracted a wide cross-section of society. A dock worker, a clerk, a seamstress, and even the occasional gentleman might find themselves elbow to elbow at the long, polished counter. It was a rare place where London's rigid social divisions softened, if only temporarily. This mingling of classes created a particular energy. For working people, drinking in a palace meant entering a world of glamour usually reserved for the wealthy. For middle-class clerks or shopkeepers, stepping into the bustle of the gin palace allowed them to escape the stifling respectability of parlor life. Each group observed the other. A gentleman might watch with curiosity how laborers joked and argued. A laundress might copy the gestures or phrases of those she perceived as more refined. In this way, the gin palace became a site of cultural exchange, sometimes inspiring, sometimes uneasy. But the palace was not a democratic utopia. Gender roles, for one, remained sharply visible. Women were present in these establishments, but their experience was complicated. Respectable women of the middle classes often avoided gin palaces entirely, associating them with scandal and vice. Yet working-class women, laundresses, factory girls, flower sellers, were frequent patrons. For them, a gin palace offered warmth, light, and company after a long day. They could drink, gossip, and sometimes even conduct business there. Still, moralists condemned their presence, arguing that women in public drinking spaces represented a breakdown of family order. To heighten this sense of theater, everything about the design of a gin palace encouraged display. Those grand mirrors behind the bar allowed patrons to see themselves, as though they were actors on a stage. The glittering bottles of gin, arranged almost like props, reinforced the illusion. A man leaning at the counter wasn't simply quenching his thirst. He was participating in a spectacle, his gestures magnified by light and reflection. The act of drinking itself carried ritual significance. Customers rarely lingered at tables in the early gin palaces. Instead, they stood at the bar, ordered quickly, and drank standing. This created constant movement. Elbows bumped, voices rose, and the atmosphere was one of bustle rather than repose. Observers compared it to a marketplace, only instead of vegetables and fish, the commodity exchanged was gin. Each interaction, coins sliding across the counter, glasses being refilled, jokes shouted over the din, contributed to the theater of the space. Then there were the barmaids, central characters in the nightly performance. Young, often attractively dressed, and trained to be quick with both hands and wit, barmaids became icons of the gin palace. To many customers, they embodied the glamour of the establishment. Their presence encouraged men to buy more drinks, linger longer, and return again.
but their role was precarious. Barmaids were often sexualized and morally judged, yet their wages depended on charm and efficiency. They had to navigate flirtation, harassment, and heavy labor, all under the watchful gaze of the mirrored walls. Music and conversation layered onto this spectacle. Though not formal concert halls, many gin palaces had musicians, often fiddlers or pianists, playing popular tunes. Customers sang along, creating an atmosphere of communal noise. The chatter itself was constant. Arguments about wages, gossip about neighbors, boasts and confessions. In an age before cinema or radio, the Gin Palace provided live, unscripted entertainment performed nightly by its own patrons. Of course, reformers saw all of this very differently. To them, the social theater of the Gin Palace was dangerous precisely because it blurred boundaries. When classes mixed, when women drank alongside men, when laughter drowned out restraint, moral order seemed at risk. They warned that such spaces encouraged immorality, crime, and the neglect of family duties. Campaigners painted lurid pictures of ruined households, hungry children, and drunken brawls spilling onto the streets. Yet, for many Londoners, the palace was not a site of ruin, but of respite. In cramped housing with little privacy, the Gin Palace provided a rare sense of freedom. In harsh working conditions, it offered warmth and light. In lives often marked by monotony, it offered drama. Even those who condemned it could not deny its magnetism. Dickens himself admitted that the sheer spectacle was perfectly dazzling, even if he questioned its morality. The social theater of gin palaces also had a political dimension. Debates about them fed into wider discussions about the condition of England question, how to address poverty, urbanization, and moral decline. Reformers demanded stricter licensing laws, while defenders argued that gin palaces were legitimate businesses providing affordable leisure. In Parliament, journalists, and pulpits, the question of drinking became a proxy for anxieties about the rapid changes of industrial society. What fascinates us today is how vividly this theater lives on in descriptions. Contemporary observers wrote about the noise, the heat, the clinking of glasses, and the press of bodies. Artists sketched the glittering counters, the mirrored walls, and the clusters of drinkers. For modern readers, these accounts bring the Gin Palace to life, not as a building frozen in time, but as a living drama, messy, noisy, and deeply human.
When we think of Victorian nightlife, it is tempting to imagine restraint and propriety. But step into a gin palace, and the picture changes. Here, rules bent, classes mingled, and performances unfolded. It was not always respectable, nor always safe, but it was undeniably alive. The theater of drinking in a gin palace captured something essential about Victorian urban life: the tension between order and chaos, respectability and indulgence, tradition and modernity. And so the Gin Palace reminds us that history is not only about buildings or laws, it is about people, their gestures, their conversations, their moments of escape. Each glass raised in those glittering rooms was part of a larger play, one that drew audiences night after night. Whether judged as vice or celebrated as vitality, the social theater of drinking remains one of the most revealing windows into Victorian life. If there was one figure who symbolized the Gin Palace as much as the glittering mirrors and dazzling chandeliers, it was the barmaid. Step into a Victorian gin palace and it would not take long before you noticed her. Behind the long polished counter,
moving quickly yet gracefully, she was more than just an employee. She was, in many ways, the public face of the establishment. To understand the Victorian gin palace, one must pause to understand the role of the barmaid, not only in terms of labor, but also in culture, perception, and controversy. The Victorian barmaid was often young, usually in her late teens or early 20s, and chosen as much for her appearance and manner as for her ability to serve drinks. Employers knew that customers would return more often if the barmaids were charming, witty, and easy on the eye. Thus, advertisements for barmaid positions sometimes emphasized not simply experience, but attractiveness. In the competitive world of the gin palace, the barmaid herself became part of the allure, a living ornament to match the etched glass and polished brass. But her job was far from easy. The barmaid stood for hours at a time, often in hot, crowded rooms filled with smoke and chatter. She had to remember orders, handle money, keep her hands moving quickly, and deal with intoxicated customers, all while maintaining an air of composure. Many were praised for their ability to keep conversation lively, to respond to jokes or flirtation with humor, and to keep tempers from flaring when the palace grew crowded. They were workers, entertainers, and diplomats all at once. In addition to serving, barmaids had to be vigilant. Victorian gin palaces were places of bustle, and not all customers behaved well. A barmaid was expected to keep an eye on the crowd, watch for troublemakers, and in some cases refuse service to those already too drunk. She had to balance friendliness with firmness, knowing when to smile and when to shut down an unwanted advance. The role required emotional intelligence long before that phrase existed. This central position made barmaids highly visible figures, and with visibility came moral scrutiny. Social commentators wrote endlessly about them. To reformers, barmaids symbolized the dangers of public drinking. They claimed that young women placed in such positions were exposed to corruption, temptation, and ruin. They argued that serving men alcohol night after night would inevitably lead to impropriety. In pamphlets and speeches, barmaids were painted as both victims and villains, innocent girls lured into a life of degradation, or sly seductresses encouraging men to drink more than they should. But this picture was far from complete. Many barmaids saw their work as practical employment, offering wages higher than those of domestic service. Unlike maids in private households, barmaids had a measure of independence. They lived in lodgings rather than servants' quarters, had evenings filled with activity rather than isolation, and often earned enough to support themselves or even contribute to their families. For some, the gin palace provided not corruption, but opportunity. Still, the contradictions remained. Newspapers occasionally ran sensational stories about barmaids who married wealthy patrons, suggesting a Cinderella-like possibility. Others focused on scandals, portraying them as fallen women. In reality, the majority led ordinary lives, working long shifts and enduring the challenges of the job with resilience. But because they stood at the heart of such glamorous establishments, their image loomed large in the Victorian imagination. The uniform of the barmaid further reinforced her role. Unlike the rough clothes of laundresses or the aprons of factory girls, barmaids often wore neat, fashionable dresses. They were not extravagantly dressed like aristocratic ladies, but they were expected to look polished and attractive. The gleam of the gin palace interior reflected on them, making them part of the spectacle. Their attire distinguished them from customers and made them recognizable as figures of authority within the noisy space. Writers of the time were fascinated by barmaids. Some described them with admiration, praising their wit and beauty. Others condemned them as symbols of decline. Charles Dickens himself, while captivated by the splendor of gin palaces, expressed unease at the sight of young women working behind a bar. To him and many of his contemporaries, it seemed inappropriate that women should be so publicly engaged in selling alcohol. But this moral discomfort also reveals the limits of Victorian gender norms. The barmaid stood as a figure who did not quite fit into established categories. She was neither a domestic servant, nor a factory hand, nor a lady. She was something in between, independent yet vulnerable, respectable yet suspect. This tension meant that barmaids were not only workers, but cultural symbols. They appeared in novels, plays, and illustrations. Satirical magazines used their image to poke fun at social anxieties. Moral reform groups used their presence to argue for stricter licensing laws. And customers themselves often mythologized them, turning ordinary young women into characters of fascination.
But behind the myths lay reality. Many barmaids worked grueling hours for modest wages. Some faced harassment from customers or exploitation from employers. Few found the glamorous marriages the papers hinted at. And yet, many endured, seeing the job as preferable to the drudgery of other forms of employment available to working-class women. Their lives were ordinary, shaped by work, family, and survival, even if the public insisted on seeing them as extraordinary. The role of the barmaid also highlights a broader truth about Victorian gin palaces. These establishments were not just places where people drank, they were complex social environments shaped by performance, gender, and labor. To understand them, we must look not only at architecture and alcohol, but at the human figures who made them function. The barmaid, with her quick hands, sharp eyes, and balancing act between charm and caution, was essential to the daily drama of the palace. When we think of Victorian drinking culture, it is easy to focus on reform debates, statistics, and architecture. But to step into a gin palace as it truly was, one must imagine the barmaid at her post, steady, watchful, and central. She was not only pouring gin, she was managing a crowd, sustaining an atmosphere, and embodying a role that both reflected and challenged Victorian ideals. In the end, the barmaid reminds us that history is lived in the details, in the gestures of those who worked, the words of those who criticized, and the resilience of those who endured. To the customers, she may have been part of the glamour. To reformers, part of the problem. To herself, she was simply making a living in a changing world. And it is in this mixture of perception and reality that the true role of the barmaid emerges, as a symbol of Victorian society itself, glittering, troubled, and endlessly fascinating. The rise of gin palaces was dazzling, but with their glittering lamps and mirrored walls came unease. For many Victorians, the gin palace embodied both progress and peril. It was a beacon of urban modernity, yet also a lightning rod for moral panic. To understand this anxiety, we must step into the uneasy space where pleasure and prohibition collide. From the earliest days of distilled spirits, gin had been linked with excess. The so-called gin craze of the 18th century had already burned into the cultural memory. Mothers slipping into drunken neglect, men wasting wages at the bar, families shattered by addiction. Those images, immortalized by Hogarth's famous engraving Gin Lane, lingered long after the crisis itself had passed. Even as 19th century gin palaces boasted refinement and order, the shadow of Gin Lane haunted them. Reformers feared that behind the chandeliers and etched glass, the same old demons lurked. What made gin so alarming, more than ale or even brandy, was its association with speed. Ale drinking was slow, sociable, tied to meals and rural tradition. But gin, cheap, potent, easily swallowed, was fast. It promised escape in minutes, not hours. Social critics described this speed with dread. A worker could leave his job sober and return home staggering, all within an hour. That rapid intoxication symbolized a loss of control, both personal and societal. The very architecture of gin palaces contributed to suspicion. Their glowing windows, inviting customers at all hours, gave them a sense of seduction. A gin palace did not look like a public house rooted in community custom. It looked like a lure. To reformers, those lamps were not symbols of progress, but beacons drawing the unwary into vice. The polished counters and gilt ornaments, they said, disguised moral decay beneath a sheen of respectability. Medical discourse added to the panic. Doctors in the 1830s and 40s began writing treatises on the dangers of distilled spirits, often describing gin as a poison to body and mind. Pamphlets circulated with alarming claims. Gin corroded the stomach lining, destroyed the liver, weakened the moral faculties, and, in women, ruined the capacity for motherhood. These warnings merged health concerns with social fears. A drunken man was a problem. A drunken mother was a national crisis. Women and gin became a recurring theme of Victorian anxiety. Like beer houses, which were largely male spaces, gin palaces were strikingly open to women. For the first time, large numbers of women could enter a public drinking establishment without the stigma of tavern culture. Some embraced this new freedom. Domestic servants, shop girls, and widows found a rare social space within those mirrored halls. But moralists fretted. A woman sipping gin in public challenged traditional boundaries of domestic virtue. Worse than that, reformers linked female drinking to sexual looseness. The phrase gin-soaked became shorthand for a woman of fallen reputation. This fusion of gender panic with class anxiety made gin palaces a perfect target. Reformers saw them as breeding grounds for prostitution, domestic disorder, and working-class unrest. Middle-class commentators wrote lurid descriptions of women pawning household goods to buy gin, or mothers nursing infants while half intoxicated. Whether exaggerated or not, such stories fueled campaigns for tighter licensing laws and greater surveillance of public houses. Religious groups also joined the chorus. Evangelical preachers warned that gin palaces were gateways to hell, dens of temptation where souls were lost nightly. The bright lights, they argued, mocked the darkness of sin within. Tracts compared the sparkle of a gin glass to Satan's baited hook. In sermons, gin was not merely unhealthy, it was unholy. Campaigns like the Band of Hope, founded in the 1840s, targeted children with temperance pledges, hoping to inoculate the next generation against the lure of the dram. The press amplified these anxieties. Illustrated papers carried both admiring sketches of gin palace interiors and stark warnings about the dangers within. Contradiction was everywhere. One week praising their elegance, the next condemning their moral corruption. This oscillation reflected the broader tension in Victorian society between fascination with progress and fear of decline.
Policymakers struggled with the balance. On one hand, gin palaces brought revenue through licensing fees and taxes. On the other, they stirred public disorder and moral critique. A series of reforms attempted to regulate opening hours, reduce drinking among the poor, and curtail spirit consumption. Yet the very visibility of gin palaces, their prominence on urban streets, made enforcement difficult. You could not quietly regulate away a building that glowed like a beacon in the night. It is important to note that much of the panic was symbolic. Gin palaces did not single-handedly destroy families or breed crime on the scale critics suggested. Many customers drank moderately. Many establishments maintained order. But the cultural weight of gin, its history, Its speed, its femininity, made it an easy scapegoat for deeper social anxieties. Industrialization was uprooting communities. Urbanization was crowding families into unhealthy quarters. And gender roles were shifting under the pressure of new labor markets. Gin palaces became a visible emblem onto which all those fears could be projected. At the same time, they also provided a stage for resistance. Working-class patrons defended their right to leisure and sociability. For many, a visit to the gin palace was not moral decline, but a necessary release from exhausting labor and cramped housing. They resented the paternalism of reformers who judged their pleasures from a distance. In this sense, the panic around gin reflected not only concerns about alcohol, but about class control, about who had the right to decide how others lived. Looking back, we can see that the moral panic around gin was part of a broader Victorian pattern. Every new leisure form, music halls, dance halls, even cinemas in later decades, faced similar waves of suspicion. Each new pleasure space was cast first as a threat, then gradually absorbed into social norms. Gin palaces, once denounced as dens of ruin, would by the end of the century be reimagined as respectable public houses, their flamboyant designs tamed into the heritage of English pub culture. But in their heyday, they glowed at the center of controversy. To walk into a gin palace was to step not only into a room of mirrors and lamps, but into the contested heart of Victorian morality. The clink of glasses echoed against the sermons of preachers, the pens of reformers, and the laws of Parliament. Pleasure and panic, freedom and fear, they mingled in every sip. And so the story of gin palaces is incomplete without this darker lens. They were not merely architectural marvels or social hubs, but battlegrounds of meaning. In their polished surfaces, Victorians saw both the promise of modern leisure and the specter of national decline. The moral panic around gin tells us less about alcohol itself than about the deep anxieties of a society in transition, anxieties about class, gender, health, and the fragile fabric of order in an industrial age. The Victorian Gin Palace stood not only as an architectural wonder and a social experiment, but also as a challenge to lawmakers. Its sheer visibility demanded a response. Unlike the humble alehouse tucked into side streets, the Gin Palace dominated the urban landscape with gaslit brilliance. Legislators could not ignore such a presence. Thus, the 19th century saw a wave of efforts to regulate, license, and control the consumption of spirits, efforts that reveal as much about politics and power as they do about alcohol itself. The long shadow of the gin craze. To understand Victorian regulation, we must first recall the legislative scars of the 18th century. The infamous gin craze had prompted Parliament to introduce draconian laws like the Gin Acts of 1729 and 1736, which attempted to tax and suppress the spirit trade. Those acts had failed spectacularly, leading to riots and widespread smuggling. By the early 1800s, lawmakers had learned at least one lesson. Outright prohibition was neither enforceable nor wise. Regulation, not eradication, would be the Victorian strategy. The Beer House Act of 1830. A pivotal moment came with the Beer House Act of 1830. Parliament, alarmed by drunkenness but convinced that beer was a safer alternative to spirits, liberalized beer sales while tightening controls on gin. The act allowed householders who paid a small fee to sell beer from their own premises. The hope was simple: flood the market with beer, reduce spirit consumption, and tame the drunkenness problem. The unintended consequence was explosive growth in beer houses. Tens of thousands opened within a decade. But gin palaces remained popular, drawing criticism from reformers who believed the law had failed to lure people away from spirits. In practice, the 1830 Act widened the drinking landscape rather than replacing one form of alcohol with another. Beer houses and gin palaces thrived side by side, giving Victorians more choice, but legislators more headaches. Licensing systems. At the heart of Victorian regulation was the licensing system. No spirit retailer could operate legally without a license, and these licenses were controlled by local magistrates. This system, dating back to the Alehouse Act of 1552, gave enormous discretion to local justices of peace. They could refuse licenses, limit opening hours, or revoke rights entirely. For reformers, this was a useful tool. By lobbying magistrates, they could pressure local authorities to reduce the number of drinking establishments. For publicans, however, it meant insecurity. A gin palace might be beautifully built, lavishly decorated, and profitable, but its fate ultimately rested in the hands of a few local officials, often drawn from the very middle-class reformers who disapproved of such places.
Sunday closing and restricted hours. Another battleground was time. Reformers targeted opening hours as a way to curtail drinking. Laws were introduced to restrict Sunday trading, reflecting the belief that the Sabbath should be free from worldly indulgence. Campaigners argued that Sunday drinking led to domestic violence, missed church services, and a general erosion of moral discipline. The Sunday closing acts varied by region, but shared a common spirit. They attempted to use time itself as a regulatory tool. Closing hours were likewise adjusted throughout the century. The 1872 Licensing Act, for instance, introduced more consistent national hours of operation, seeking to standardize what had been a patchwork of local regulations. The role of the police. Policing the gin palace was as much symbolic as practical. The sight of uniformed officers patrolling streets where gin palaces glowed was intended to deter disorder. Inside, constables had the right to monitor behavior and enforce licensing law. Public drunkenness became not just a social problem, but a criminal offense. Arrests for intoxication soared during the mid-Victorian years, creating a visible link between drinking and law enforcement. Critics argued this criminalization targeted the poor disproportionately. Wealthier patrons could drink in private clubs, shielded from police scrutiny, while working-class gin palace customers were far more vulnerable to arrest. Regulation, in this sense, reinforced class divisions even as it claimed to promote public order. Temperance pressure. Behind nearly every licensing reform stood the temperance movement. Organizations like the United Kingdom Alliance and the Band of Hope mobilized petitions, rallies, and lobbying campaigns to pressure Parliament. They demanded stricter laws, higher licensing fees, and limits on advertising. Their language was often moral, but their methods were strikingly political, demonstrating how leisure spaces could become arenas of civic struggle. For temperance activists, the goal was not simply to control alcohol, but to reshape society. They saw drinking as a root cause of poverty, crime, and domestic violence. By restricting access to gin palaces, they believed they could engineer a healthier, more disciplined working class. In practice, however, regulation often displaced rather than eliminate drinking, driving some into illegal shebeens or private gatherings. The 1872 Licensing Act. If one law symbolizes the Victorian approach to alcohol, it is the Licensing Act of 1872. This act consolidated earlier measures and tightened control across the board.
It standardized opening hours, increased penalties for drunkenness, and gave magistrates broader powers to revoke licenses. For the first time, publicans could be punished not only for serving intoxicated customers, but also for permitting disorderly conduct on their premises. The act was celebrated by reformers as a victory for morality. Newspapers praised its firm hand in taming the excesses of drink. Yet critics complained it criminalized ordinary leisure and empowered magistrates to act with arbitrary authority. Many working-class communities saw the act less as protection than as an intrusion into their cultural life. The paradox of regulation. Regulation was never a simple matter of reducing drinking. Paradoxically, it often legitimized the very institutions it sought to restrain. By granting licenses, the state acknowledged that gin palaces had a lawful place in society. By taxing alcohol, it became financially dependent on its sale. The excise duties on spirits contributed heavily to government revenue, creating a tension between moral condemnation and fiscal necessity. Publicans, meanwhile, used regulation to their advantage. A licensed gin palace could advertise itself as respectable, sanctioned by the state, and therefore preferable to unregulated drinking dens. Far from destroying the gin palace, regulation sometimes reinforced its authority. Control and respectability. Over time, the harsh glare of the early gin palace softened. Licensing laws, combined with changing tastes, gradually reshaped these establishments. By the late 19th century, many gin palaces rebranded as respectable public houses, catering to families and communities rather than to desperate drinkers. Their ornate architecture survived, but their reputations improved. Regulation, in this sense, helped domesticate what had once been feared as wild and dangerous. Broader implications. Ultimately, the story of regulation and licensing is less about alcohol itself than about governance. Victorian lawmakers used gin palaces as a testing ground for broader questions. How much should the state intervene in private behavior? How far should local authorities control working-class leisure? Could morality be legislated? The answers were inconsistent and contested, but the struggle itself left a lasting mark. The modern British pub, licensed, regulated, and socially accepted, owes its shape to the Victorian battle over gin palaces. And the broader lesson endures. Pleasure may be personal, but its regulation is always political. If the gin palace embodied the temptations of Victorian nightlife, the temperance movement embodied the resistance. It is impossible to talk about gin palaces without also talking about those who opposed them: preachers, reformers, social activists, and ordinary citizens who believed that alcohol was the single greatest threat to moral, spiritual, and social order. Their campaigns were relentless, sometimes earnest, sometimes theatrical, and always aimed squarely at changing both behavior and law. Roots in moral reform. The temperance movement was not unique to Britain. It grew as part of a wider wave of evangelical revivalism sweeping the 19th century English-speaking world. Just as Methodists and Baptists preached about personal salvation, reformers began to preach about personal sobriety. The idea was simple. A sober man was a moral man, and a sober nation would be a righteous one. In early decades, temperance did not necessarily mean total abstinence. The word itself comes from the idea of moderation, and many early reformers were content to advocate reduced drinking, particularly avoiding spirits like gin. But as the century progressed, abstinence became the dominant demand. By the mid-1800s, total prohibition of alcohol was the dream, and teeter-tottalism entered the language.
Teetotal societies.
The spread of teetotal societies was one of the most visible expressions of the movement. These groups, often led by charismatic speakers, persuaded members to sign pledges promising never to drink alcohol again. The act of signing a pledge was not simply personal. It was public, sometimes done in ceremonies where witnesses applauded. It symbolized both commitment and community, binding individuals into a movement that transcended class and region. Many societies targeted children as well as adults. The Band of Hope, founded in 1847, recruited young people into temperance with rallies, songs, and badges. By training children early, reformers hoped to raise a generation immune to the lure of the gin palace. These youthful recruits were often marched into processions, singing hymns and holding banners, a visible reminder that the next generation might escape the sins of the current one. Evangelical zeal. The tone of temperance campaigns was frequently evangelical. Reformers framed alcohol not merely as a health issue, but as a spiritual enemy. Sermons depicted drink as the devil's tool, a corrupting force that dragged men to ruin and women to despair. In this framing, gin palaces were not businesses, but temples of sin, glowing on street corners as invitations to damnation. This religious fervor lent temperance campaigns a sense of moral urgency. Reformers spoke as though they were saving souls as much as bodies. Meetings often resembled revivalist gatherings, with testimonies from reformed drunkards who stood before audiences to declare how abstinence had rescued them from poverty and despair. These stories, both heartbreaking and hopeful, gave the movement an emotional power that statistics alone could not achieve. Women and temperance. Women played a central role in the temperance movement, and for good reason. Alcohol was often associated with domestic violence, financial instability, and neglect of children. Wives and mothers bore the brunt of these consequences, so they became some of the movement's most passionate advocates. Female-led organizations like the British Women's Temperance Association gave women a political voice at a time when they lacked the vote. Campaigning for temperance was one of the earliest forms of organized activism for women, laying groundwork for later feminist movements. Their rallies and writings portrayed sobriety as not only a personal virtue, but also a protection for homes and families. In speeches, women frequently framed their activism around the image of the suffering wife. A drunken husband, they argued, meant empty cupboards, beaten children, and broken homes. By opposing the gin palace, women claimed to defend the sanctity of the Victorian household itself. The language of respectability. Temperance advocates were skilled at using the language of respectability. They contrasted the chaotic, noisy atmosphere of the gin palace with the calm, ordered domestic home. To drink was to fall into disorder. To abstain was to claim dignity. This framing resonated strongly with the growing Victorian middle class who prized self-control, thrift, and social standing. By aligning sobriety with respectability, temperance reformers turned abstinence into a social badge of honor. Wearing a temperance ribbon or carrying a pledge card became signals of moral standing. To join a temperance society was not just to give up drink, but to join a community that valued discipline and virtue. Public demonstrations. One of the movement's most striking strategies was its use of public demonstrations. Temperance parades filled the streets with banners, brass bands, and chants. These processions were not mere entertainments, but acts of social theater,
deliberately staged to rival the allure of public drinking houses. Meetings were equally dramatic. Large rallies drew thousands into halls or open fields where speakers combined moral appeals with vivid illustrations of the horrors of drink. Theatrical props were sometimes employed, coffins labeled "Victim of Gin," for instance, or charts showing the economic cost of drunkenness. These demonstrations sought to make the dangers of alcohol visible, tangible, and unforgettable. The political wing. Although rooted in moral suasion, the temperance movement soon turned political. The United Alliance, founded in 1853, aimed not just to persuade individuals, but to pressure Parliament into legislative change. Its leaders argued that moral reform was impossible without political action. They lobbied for higher taxes on spirits, stricter licensing laws, and ultimately, prohibition. This turn toward politics revealed a tension within the movement. Some members insisted on personal choice and persuasion. Others demanded state coercion. The debate mirrored broader Victorian anxieties about the role of government in regulating personal behavior. In the end, the political temperance lobby became one of the most influential reform groups of the century, shaping the Licensing Act of 1872 and other measures. Opposition and mockery. Not everyone embraced temperance. Critics mocked teetotalers as humorless fanatics who sought to rob ordinary people of their pleasures. Satirical cartoons depicted reformers as scolds, nagging wives, or hypocrites who secretly indulged in other vices. The Gin Palace itself, with its glittering lights and convivial atmosphere, seemed to stand as a rebuke to the austere moralism of the movement. Yet even critics admitted the movement's influence. Whether loved or mocked, the temperance campaigners altered the national conversation. They forced Victorians to confront the social costs of drinking and to consider alcohol not merely as a private choice, but as a public issue. The legacy of campaigns. By the late 19th century, the temperance movement had woven itself into the fabric of Victorian life. Its songs, rallies, and pledges were familiar cultural markers. While it never achieved full prohibition in Britain, it did leave lasting legacies. Drinking became more regulated. Gin palaces toned down their reputations, and the idea of sobriety as a respectable choice gained wide acceptance. Perhaps its greatest achievement was its power to organize. The movement gave ordinary people, especially women and children, a platform to speak publicly about moral and social concerns. It demonstrated that collective activism could change laws and shape culture. Even if gin palaces never disappeared, they were forever shadowed by the banners, marches, and moral rhetoric of temperance campaigners.
Every cultural phenomenon has its rise, its golden age, and, eventually, its decline. Gin palaces were no exception. From the glittering gas-lit dens of the mid-19th century to their gradual fading in the decades that followed, their story reflects the wider social, economic, and political shifts of Victorian Britain. The decline of the Gin Palace was not sudden, nor was it total. Rather, it was a slow transformation as changing tastes, stricter laws, and evolving urban life reshaped both the physical buildings and their cultural meaning. The waning glow of gaslight. In their earliest decades, gin palaces dazzled precisely because they were new. Gaslighting, ornate glasswork, and bright mirrors gave them an aura unlike anything else on the street. But by the second half of the 19th century, these features no longer seemed quite as magical.
As gas lamps spread across cities and shop windows grew larger, the spectacle of the gin palace lost some of its novelty. What was once breathtaking began to feel ordinary, even gaudy. This diminishing sense of glamour meant that gin palaces could no longer rely solely on spectacle to draw crowds. They needed to adapt, offering more than glittering facades to keep customers loyal. Some did so by expanding their offerings, serving food, or investing in entertainment, but the competition was growing fierce. Competition from other venues. Gin palaces also faced competition from other drinking establishments. The rise of the music hall, with its combination of live entertainment and drink, provided an alternative that seemed livelier and more respectable. Public houses, too, were undergoing transformations, adopting some of the decor and style of the gin palace while retaining their traditional community feel. For many working-class patrons, the music hall offered not only drink, but spectacle, song, and socializing on a larger scale. By contrast, the gin palace, though ornate, could seem one-dimensional. The variety of leisure options in urban cities expanded, and with it, the gin palace's hold on urban nightlife loosened. Stricter licensing laws. Perhaps the most significant factor in the decline of gin palaces was legislation. Throughout the 19th century, Parliament passed increasingly strict licensing laws, spurred on by temperance campaigners and public concern over drunkenness. The Licensing Act of 1872 was particularly influential. It imposed closing times, restricted hours of sale, and gave police greater powers to intervene in cases of disorder. Where once gin palaces could stay open long into the night, serving customers until the early hours, now they had to abide by fixed hours. These regulations curbed both the volume of alcohol consumed and the profits made by proprietors. Other measures targeted the sale of spirits specifically. Taxes on gin increased, making it less accessible to the very poor who had once been their core customers. Beer, often cheaper and less stigmatized, became a more common choice. Over time, this economic pressure shifted drinking habits away from spirits and toward ale, further eroding the gin palace's distinctiveness. Changing public attitudes. Victorian society itself was changing. By the later decades of the century, values of sobriety, thrift, and self-improvement became central to middle-class respectability. The figure of the drunken working man stumbling out of a gin palace came to symbolize decline rather than rebellion. Respectable Victorians increasingly turned away from the spectacle of public drinking houses, preferring private clubs or drawing room sociability. Even among the working classes, the glamour of gin lost some of its shine. New forms of recreation, such as football matches and seaside excursions, offered alternative ways to spend both money and leisure time. The culture of the gin palace, once at the heart of urban entertainment, began to feel outdated against this wider menu of pleasures. Architectural transformation. One of the most interesting aspects of the decline of gin palaces was how their architecture adapted. Many of the buildings themselves did not disappear. Instead, they were absorbed into the evolving world of the public house. By the late 19th century, gin palaces were increasingly rebranded as pubs, keeping their ornate glasswork and mirrors, but softening their identity. The glowing gin palaces became less about the hard edge of spirits and more about beer and general conviviality. The very term gin palace began to fade, replaced by the more familiar public house or pub. Some of the grander gin palaces were demolished as cities redeveloped, but others survived, repurposed or renamed, their architecture serving as a reminder of an earlier, more flamboyant age. Even today, a handful of Victorian pubs retain features that echo their origins as gin palaces: etched glass panels, ornate bar fittings, and expansive mirrors. The role of temperance pressure. It would be impossible to understand the transformation of gin palaces without considering the sustained pressure of the temperance movement. By constantly framing gin as a social evil and pushing for legal restrictions, reformers made it harder for gin palaces to maintain their image as glamorous hubs of conviviality. Temperance propaganda reshaped the cultural imagination. Where once gin had been associated with urban excitement, it was increasingly tied to images of poverty, neglect, and moral ruin. This moral framing stuck, and even as palaces adapted, they could never fully shake off the stigma attached to their name. From palaces to relics. By the end of the 19th century, the gin palace as a distinct cultural phenomenon had largely passed its peak. They no longer symbolized modernity or urban excitement. Instead, they were relics of a more garlish and less restrained age. Yet, in their decline, they paved the way for the evolution of the modern British pub. In this sense, the gin palace did not disappear. It transformed. Its innovations in design, its focus on spectacle, and its emphasis on attracting large urban crowds were absorbed into pub culture. Today's pubs, with their stained glass, polished wood, and convivial atmosphere, carry traces of that Victorian extravagance.
Legacy in memory and myth. The decline of gin palaces also gave rise to nostalgia. Writers and artists began to look back on them with a mixture of fascination and disapproval. Some painted them as dens of vice, symbols of the moral corruption of industrial cities. Others romanticized their glittering lights and bustling crowds, seeing them as part of the colorful fabric of Victorian life. That tension between condemnation and fascination remains even today. When we talk about gin palaces, we do so with a sense of both awe and caution, remembering them as places of dazzling architecture and questionable reputation. Their decline reminds us how fleeting cultural fads can be, and how swiftly symbols of modernity can become relics of the past. If one peers into the pages of Victorian newspapers or glances at the satirical cartoons of the era, women often appear as central figures in the story of gin. Their faces were drawn with deep lines of care or with exaggerated expressions of folly. They were mothers, workers, wives, widows, and yet in the moral imagination of the age, they became the embodiment of both virtue at risk and vice unrestrained. To talk about the role of women in Victorian gin culture is to unpick a dense tapestry woven of gender, class, economics, and the deep-seated anxieties of a society in flux. Let us begin in the home, where women were often considered guardians of morality. Respectable Victorian ideology placed a heavy weight upon the shoulders of wives and mothers. The domestic sphere was their kingdom, the hearth their domain. And yet this same domestic sphere was where gin could both comfort and corrode. For many working-class women, gin was not simply an indulgence, it was a tool A small dram soothed aching muscles after endless hours at the laundry or in the factory. A nip might ease the hunger pangs when bread was scarce. In moments of despair, a cheap glass of gin provided a temporary escape from grief or worry. But gin was also closely tied to childcare in ways that troubled reformers deeply. Accounts from the period describe mothers dosing infants with gin to quiet their cries, especially in cramped lodgings where every outburst risked eviction. Disturbingly, some shopkeepers even marketed Godfrey's cordial and similar concoctions, heavily laced with alcohol and opium, to mothers desperate for rest or reprieve. To moralists, such practices were evidence of female irresponsibility. But to historians, they speak of crushing poverty, limited choices, and the immense pressures placed upon women with little support. In the gin shop itself, women occupied ambiguous roles. Middle-class commentators were shocked to see women drinking openly in public spaces. It clashed with ideals of modesty and respectability. Some gin palaces, however, welcomed female patrons, especially those in poorer districts where segregation of the sexes was impractical. Women would crowd into the glittering bars alongside dock workers, hawkers, and laborers. The sight both fascinated and scandalized Victorian observers. For reformers, it represented a collapse of moral boundaries. Wives mingling with strangers, mothers wasting household money on drink, young women jeopardizing their reputations. Yet for the women themselves, it could be a rare taste of sociability, independence, or even defiance. Not all women who drank gin were victims, however. Some were entrepreneurs. Many gin shops were family businesses, managed or co-managed by women. Widows, in particular, found in gin selling a way to sustain themselves after the loss of a husband. Licensing records reveal numerous female publicans in London during the 19th century. Their establishments might be modest, but they represented an important foothold in an otherwise male-dominated economy. The image of the landlady behind the counter, briskly pouring measures and keeping order, complicates the stereotype of the female drunkard. Nevertheless, cultural representation was skewed heavily toward the negative. Artists and caricaturists portrayed the gin-drinking woman as slovenly, neglectful, and morally ruined. William Hogarth's earlier engraving, Gin Lane, still haunted Victorian imaginations, with its gaunt mother letting her child tumble from her arms as she sipped gin. Though the engraving was 17th century, its imagery persisted, shaping discourse well into the 19th century. Women, in this moral tale, were not merely drinkers, they were corrupters of the next generation. Their fall carried social consequences beyond themselves. Temperance advocates seized on this theme. Campaigners argued that women's drinking destroyed families, impoverished households, and produced cycles of degeneracy. At temperance rallies, female sobriety was celebrated as the cornerstone of reform. Some women even became leaders within the movement, organizing ladies' temperance societies, preaching the virtues of abstinence, and modeling the ideal of pure motherhood. Here again, women were central, this time as agents of change. In their rhetoric, a sober woman could redeem a drunkard husband, safeguard her children, and uplift the nation. But beneath these sweeping moral narratives lay individual stories, some tragic, some resilient. Court records tell of women arrested for public drunkenness, often fined sums they scarcely afford. Newspaper reports relished tales of gin-mad mothers neglecting infants. Yet other documents reveal women pleading before magistrates, explaining that gin was the only relief from grinding work, grief, or the cold of winter. A fuller picture emerges when we acknowledge both the hardship and the limited avenues of escape. It is also worth noting how class shaped perception. A glass of port or sherry at a middle-class dinner party was socially acceptable, even refined. A glass of gin at a working-class bar was scandalous. Women of means who drank privately were rarely vilified. Poorer women who drank publicly were castigated. Thus, the discourse around women in gin was as much about class prejudice as about gender morality.
Literature of the period further cemented stereotypes. Novels and penny dreadfuls often featured fallen women whose decline began with gin. The drink served as shorthand for moral failure, especially for female characters. Rarely were such characters given complexity. They existed to warn readers of temptation. At the same time, some reformist tracts used sentimental portrayals of suffering mothers to garner sympathy and fuel calls for regulation. In both cases, women were instrumentalized, symbols of either degradation or redemption. Yet we must not lose sight of agency. While reformers and satirists painted women as either victims or villains, many women navigated gin culture with pragmatism. They weighed the risks, measured the costs, and made choices within constrained circumstances. For some, gin was ruin. For others, it was survival. For a few, it was profit. By the late Victorian era, as temperance movements gained ground and social reforms expanded, the image of the female gin drinker slowly gave way to a broader discussion of women's rights. Activists argued that women's oppression, poverty, and lack of political power contributed more to their struggles than any spirit could. In this way, the debate around gin intersected with early feminist concerns. Control over drink was bound up with control over women's bodies, choices, and social roles. To conclude this section, the role of women in Victorian gin culture cannot be captured by a single caricature. They were consumers, caretakers, sellers, reformers, scapegoats, and survivors. The narratives imposed upon them tell us as much about Victorian anxieties over gender and class as they do about gin itself. To understand gin in the 19th century is to see how it became a mirror in which society projected its deepest fears about women, their power, their vulnerability, their choices, and their place in a rapidly changing world. If gin was a drink, it was also an economy. Every glass poured in a Victorian gin palace carried with it an invisible network of growers, distillers, merchants, publicans, and regulators. The spirit was more than a pastime. It was an industry, a source of revenue, a source of employment, and a cause of fierce political debate. To understand Victorian gin fully, we must move beyond the bar counter and trace the flows of money, labor, and legislation that sustained it. Distilling as industry. At the heart of the gin economy were the distilleries themselves. By the 19th century, distillation had become a substantial industrial enterprise, no longer confined to small stills hidden in back rooms. Great copper stills loomed in warehouses across London and other cities, producing thousands of gallons each week. Some distillers were modest operators, serving local demand. Others grew into large companies, whose names survive even today. The process demanded grain, chiefly barley and sometimes maize. This tied gin production directly to agriculture. Farmers found steady markets in distillers, while millers, coopers, and transporters all gained business along the chain. The industry thus linked urban drinking culture with rural labor and harvests. When grain prices fluctuated, so did the economics of gin. In years of poor harvest, pressure mounted on both producers and consumers, sometimes stoking wider political unrest. Jobs in every corner. Beyond distilling, gin generated countless jobs. Publicans, barmaids, cellarmen, coopers, draymen, and glassmakers all earned livelihoods from the trade. Consider the gin palace itself. A single establishment employed not only the proprietor, but also staff to serve, clean, and manage. Suppliers provided bottles, glasses, wooden casks, and ornate mirrors. Architects and builders were paid to design and raise the grand facades that dazzled London streets. Gas fitters installed lighting, carvers supplied elaborate counters. Even the transport network was touched. Horse-drawn drays laden with barrels rumbled through city streets, while railways later expanded distribution further afield. Each step of the chain offered employment to men and women whose wages depended directly or indirectly on the steady flow of gin. Barmaids and employment for women. One curious aspect of the gin economy was the prominence of women behind the counter. Victorian observers often commented on the figure of the barmaid, youthful, witty, and sometimes controversial. Bar work provided rare employment for young women in urban areas. Wages were not high, but the position carried a certain social visibility. Some moralists fretted that barmaids encouraged male drinking through flirtation. Others saw them as industrious and respectable. In either case, the barmaid became a fixture of gin culture, symbolizing both opportunity and danger in the gendered labor market. The taxman's drink. If distillers and workers gained wages from gin, the state gained taxes. Few commodities were so heavily regulated or so lucratively taxed. Excise duties on spirits had long been a central revenue stream for the British government. By the Victorian period, these duties were carefully calibrated, high enough to fill the treasury, but not so high as to encourage rampant smuggling or illicit distilling. For governments, gin was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it provided millions in revenue that funded armies, infrastructure, and social programs. On the other, it fueled social problems that required costly policing and reform. Politicians thus wrestled constantly with the question how much taxation would maximize revenue without sparking moral outrage or black market evasion. Taxation was not merely an economic question, it was a moral battleground. Temperance campaigners argued that the state was complicit in vice by profiting from alcohol. They demanded tighter restrictions or even prohibition. Meanwhile, publicans and distillers lobbied fiercely to protect their trade. Parliamentary debates became arenas where revenue and morality collided. The fate of gin duties was never purely fiscal. It reflected deeper cultural struggles over the soul of the nation.
Global trade. Gin's economy also extended beyond Britain's borders. The empire provided both markets and materials. Colonies shipped sugar, spices, and botanicals that flavored spirits. British gin, in turn, traveled overseas to soldiers, sailors, and settlers. Gin was particularly associated with the colonial experience, its bitterness offset by tonic water laced with quinine, which was believed to ward off malaria. Thus, the drink tied into imperial commerce, medical practice, and cultural identity abroad. International trade also meant competition. Imported spirits, like rum and brandy, jostled with gin for consumer loyalty. Tariffs and treaties shaped their relative prices, influencing what working-class and middle-class Britons could afford to drink. In this sense, gin was not only a domestic industry, but also a player in the global economic game. The politics of licensing. No discussion of the gin economy can ignore licensing. Every gin shop, from the Grand Palace to the modest bar, operated under licenses regulated by local magistrates and national law. Licenses generated fees, created bureaucratic structures, and offered a means of state oversight. They also became political flashpoints. Decisions to grant or deny licenses were shaped by class, morality, and influence. A respectable widow might struggle to secure a license. A well-connected businessman might obtain one more easily. Licensing thus structured not only who sold gin, but also who profited from it. It determined the density of drinking establishments in a neighborhood and shaped the rhythms of local economies. In districts with many licensed premises, employment and commerce thrived, but so did reformist complaints about disorder. Boom and bust. Like all industries, the gin economy experienced cycles. In periods of prosperity, new palaces were built, jobs expanded, and tax revenues swelled. In downturns, consumption fell, establishments closed, and workers were dismissed. Economic recessions and wars both disrupted the trade. The gin industry was not immune to broader forces shaping the 19th century economy, from industrial strikes to financial crises. A web of dependence. When we step back, what emerges is a web of dependence. Gin was not merely a luxury of the poor or a vice of the reckless. It was a commodity sustaining thousands of families, a revenue stream for the state, a trade good of empire, and a contested moral symbol. Its economy intertwined with every layer of Victorian society. To attack gin outright was to threaten livelihoods. To ignore its harms was to invite social breakdown. The tension between these poles defined much of 19th century debate. Legacy. By the close of the Victorian century, the gin economy had evolved. Larger companies consolidated the trade, small producers dwindled, and new competitors emerged. Yet the fundamental pattern remained: gin as a nexus of labor, tax, and politics. Its story reminds us that what appears as a simple drink is often, in truth, an entire economy distilled into a glass.